Today, we bring you a tale that dives deep into the emotional journey of abandonment, betrayal, and the long road to rebuilding what was once lost. Meet Elliot Harris, a man whose life was marked by rejection and hardship. At a young age, he was left behind by his parents, who couldn't cope with the pressures of raising a child during their own troubled marriage. For over a decade, Elliot lived in the shadow of that abandonment, raised by his elderly grandfather in a struggle for survival. But fate had other plans for him when a hidden inheritance from his late grandfather emerged, promising to change his life forever. Yet, this newfound fortune also brought with it the reappearance of the very people who had abandoned him, his estranged parents. What follows is a powerful story of betrayal, self-discovery, and the challenge of whether or not to forgive those who caused the deepest wounds. Stay tuned as we explore Elliot's journey through the complexities of family, forgiveness, and the hope of starting anew. The abandonment. Elliot Harris's life had always been defined by a profound sense of loss, beginning at the tender age of 14. He had grown up in a household filled with tension, and his parents, Linda and Daniel Harris, struggled to maintain their marriage. When Elliot reached adolescence, their relationship reached a breaking point. Unable or unwilling to cope with the difficulties of raising a teenager amid their failing relationship, they made a decision that would leave a permanent scar on their son's heart. Rather than working through their issues and seeking help, they chose the most painful route. They abandoned Elliot. In what seemed like an instant, Elliot found himself alone. His parents didn't even bother to explain their departure to him properly. One day, they simply walked away, leaving him on the doorstep of his aging grandfather's house. Walter Harris, Elliot's paternal grandfather, was a kind, gentle man who did his best to welcome his grandson with open arms. However, Walter was no spring chicken. His health was already in decline, and raising a teenage boy at his age was no small task. Nevertheless, Walter took it upon himself to care for Elliot, doing what he could to provide a safe environment. Yet, the absence of his parents left an emptiness that could not be filled. Elliot's anger, confusion, and feelings of abandonment began to take root, festering in the dark corners of his mind. Despite his grandfather's best efforts, their life together was a struggle. They lived in a rundown house, struggling to make ends meet. The pair often ate meals made from whatever little they could afford, and Elliot did his best to help out by taking odd jobs. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get by, and that's all they could hope for. However, even though Walter did what he could to be there for Elliot, the emotional void left by his parents' abandonment continued to weigh heavily on the young boy. The isolation he felt was compounded by the deep sense of betrayal. How could they just leave him? How could his parents, the ones who were supposed to love and care for him, make such a decision without a second thought? Every time he sat down at the table for a meal, the absence of his parents gnawed at him. Every birthday, every holiday, every special occasion that came and went without a phone call, a card, or even a sign of life from them served as a reminder of how abandoned he truly was. It was this deep sense of abandonment that shaped much of Elliot's adult life. He grew up without the kind of emotional security that most children take for granted. The heartbreak of being left behind by those who should have protected him made it hard for him to trust others or believe that anyone would be there for him when he needed them most. As years passed, the wounds of his childhood never fully healed. He learned to live with the pain, though it never quite disappeared. But it wasn't just his parents' absence that hurt. It was the cruel reality that, to them, it seemed as if he had never mattered. They disappeared from his life without a trace, leaving him to fend for himself. He wasn't even sure they had any real concern for him at all. They never reached out, never sent a letter, and certainly never tried to make amends. This made it clear to Elliot that, for his parents, his existence was no longer relevant. And that, in itself, was the deepest betrayal of all. Life with grandfather Walter. After being abandoned by his parents, Elliot had no choice but to rely on his grandfather, Walter Harris, to fill the gap left by his parents' absence. Walter, a kind and gentle man, had lived a long, hard-working life. Despite his age and declining health, he welcomed Elliot into his home without hesitation. The home was a modest, old house in Richmond, Virginia, which had seen better days. It wasn't much, but it was what Walter had, and it was now what Elliot had as well. However, life with Walter was far from easy. The house was small, and their finances were tight. Walter's health was deteriorating, making it increasingly difficult for him to care for Elliot as he once had. He had been diagnosed with several chronic conditions, and though his spirit remained strong, his body was starting to fail him. Despite this, Walter refused to give up. He tried his best to provide a sense of normalcy for Elliot, despite their strained circumstances. Elliot, at a young age, quickly learned the harsh realities of life. With no parents to guide him, he had to grow up fast. He took on any job he could find, mowing lawns, washing cars, running errands for neighbors. Every cent he earned went to keeping the lights on and making sure they had enough food in the house. There were times when the fridge would be empty, and Elliot would go to bed hungry, but he never complained. He knew there was no one else to rely on but himself. Yet, the emotional weight of his parents' abandonment still loomed large in his life. While Walter provided love and care, he wasn't a substitute for the parents Elliot had once had hopes of relying on. The absence of his parents was a constant, painful reminder that they had left him behind. Every time Elliot had to explain to a teacher or a friend why his parents weren't around, it felt like another cut to his already fragile self-esteem. And though Walter did his best to fill the emotional gaps, it was impossible for anyone to truly understand the depth of Elliot's hurt. As the years went by, Walter's health only worsened. Elliot watched as the once strong man who had raised him grew weaker, unable to do the things he once could. This added another layer of pressure on Elliot. It was up to him to help take care of Walter now, even though Elliot himself was still just a teenager. He helped with the groceries, made sure Walter took his medication, and helped with repairs around the house. However, no matter how much Elliot did, it never seemed like enough. There were always more things to do, and as Walter's condition worsened, the feeling of helplessness grew heavier. When Elliot turned 25, his worst fear was realized. His grandfather passed away. The man who had raised him, the only family he had left, was gone. Walter's passing left Elliot with little more than memories of the tough, selfless love he had given. The house was in poor condition, and Walter had little left to leave behind. Elliot was left to handle everything on his own. There were debts to settle, possessions to sell, and a home to clear out. There was no time to mourn properly because, for the first time in his life, Elliot was truly alone. After Walter's passing, Elliot sold whatever he could to cover the debts, but much of what Walter had accumulated over the years was of little value. The house was run down and had little left to offer. But despite all this, Elliot still felt a connection to the old house. It was the place where he had learned how to survive on his own, and though it was filled with memories of hardship, it was also the place where he had found solace after being abandoned by his parents. Selling the house was like selling a piece of his soul. At 25, Elliot was now fully responsible for his life. He had no one left to lean on. There was no safety net, no one to call when things got tough. He had learned, over the course of his life, that he could only count on himself. And while that might have been a survival mechanism, it also left him emotionally scarred. He had grown used to the idea that family was something people walked away from when things got difficult, and it was this painful belief that shaped his adult years. He was ready to move forward, but every step felt like a struggle, a reminder of all that had been lost. Despite the difficulties he had faced, Elliot's resolve grew stronger. His ability to survive without relying on anyone else gave him a sense of independence, even though it came at a great emotional cost. But little did he know, his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The unexpected inheritance. For years, Elliot had struggled to make ends meet, always feeling like he was one step away from being completely lost in the harsh reality of his life. Every day was the same, the grind of work, the worry about paying bills, and the crushing loneliness of having no one to lean on. But everything changed one fateful afternoon when an unexpected knock on his apartment door shattered the monotony of his routine. As Elliot opened the door, he was greeted by a sharply dressed man holding a crisp envelope. The man didn't say much. He merely asked if Elliot Harris was in, handed him the envelope, and left without another word. Elliot stood there for a moment, bewildered, before the curiosity and confusion took hold. As he tore open the envelope, he felt a strange mixture of anticipation and skepticism. Inside was a letter bearing the emblem of a prestigious law firm, which only added to his uncertainty. What could this be about? The letter revealed a message that would alter the course of Elliot's life forever. It was a communication from the law firm handling his late grandfather's estate. Elliot's heart raced as he read on. His grandfather, Walter Harris, had left behind a hidden trust worth $500,000. The funds had been accumulated through the sale of a piece of land many years ago, money that Walter had kept aside, untouched, for a rainy day. And that rainy day had arrived. The news left Elliot in shock. He stumbled back into his apartment, his knees buckling under the weight of the revelation. How could his grandfather, a man who had always lived modestly and struggled to make ends meet, have hidden away such a large sum of money? Walter had never once mentioned anything about this trust. It seemed impossible that the old man, who had scraped by just like Elliot, could have had the foresight to save such a fortune. It was a mystery that Elliot couldn't wrap his mind around, and yet it was undeniable. His grandfather had thought ahead, saving this money for Elliot in case he ever needed it, something Walter had done out of love, but also perhaps out of guilt for abandoning him in the early years of his life. As Elliot sat down in a chair, the letter in his hand felt heavy with significance. The trust was a lifeline, offering him a chance to escape the financial struggles that had plagued him for so long. The inheritance, though unexpected, seemed like a miracle, a gift from the past that would allow him to finally breathe. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of relief, something he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a long time. He could pay off his debts, buy a car that wasn't falling apart, and live in a place that wasn't the run-down apartment he had been stuck in. Over the next few weeks, Elliot made the necessary arrangements. He paid off all of his lingering debts, finally feeling like the financial weight that had pressed on him for so long was lifting. With the money from the trust, he was able to buy a reliable car, something he could depend on for years to come. He also moved into a modest but comfortable apartment, a place where he could feel secure and start to rebuild his life. It wasn't a mansion or a grand estate, but it was a symbol of his new beginning. Finally, for the first time in years, Elliot felt like he had control over his life. The suffocating grip of poverty and desperation had loosened its hold on him. However, just as Elliot was starting to savor his newfound stability, the unexpected took another turn. A few days later, another envelope arrived. This time, the letter was handwritten and bore the signature of someone he had not heard from in over a decade, his mother, Linda Harris. As he read the letter, the mix of emotions that flooded through him was overwhelming. The message was filled with apologies, regret, and a request for forgiveness. Linda wrote that she and Daniel, his father, had always loved him, even though they hadn't been there for him during the most difficult years of his life. She admitted they had made mistakes but hoped he would allow them back into his life. Elliot read the letter several times, trying to make sense of it. After all these years of silence, his parents suddenly wanted to reconnect, right when he had come into money. The timing was too suspicious. He had been abandoned as a child, left to fend for himself while his parents lived their lives without a care for him. He hadn't received a birthday card, a phone call, or any sign of love from them during the 12 years of separation. Now, with the inheritance, they suddenly wanted to make amends? It felt like a bitter pill to swallow, and Elliot wasn't ready to forgive them so easily. But as much as he tried to convince himself that their reappearance was nothing more than a scheme to get their hands on his newfound fortune, a small part of him still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they were sincere. Perhaps they had changed, perhaps they had genuinely missed him and wanted to make things right. Still, the memories of his childhood, the loneliness, the hurt, and the sense of betrayal, were too strong for him to simply brush aside. He couldn't help but feel that their sudden interest in him had more to do with his inheritance than with any real desire to rebuild their broken relationship. The arrival of Linda's letter, coupled with the realization that his parents were trying to come back into his life, was a complicated and confusing moment for Elliot. He was finally in a position where he could build a future, and now, with the return of his parents, he found himself confronted with the ghosts of his past. Would he open his heart to them again? Or would he shut them out for good? The return of his parents. The arrival of the letter from his mother, Linda, was only the beginning of a whirlwind that Elliot was unprepared for. After over a decade of silence, his parents reappeared in his life with startling suddenness. It wasn't just the letter that left him unsettled, it was everything that followed. The timing of their return felt far too coincidental. 4 years, they had abandoned him without a single word of apology or effort to reconnect. Now, when he had come into money, they wanted to come back. The thought gnawed at Elliot, but he could not ignore the deep-seated anger that had built up over the years. How could they just waltz back into his life after all this time? Elliot wasn't prepared to let his guard down so easily. His skepticism grew when a few days later, his phone rang with an all-too-familiar number flashing on the screen. His father, Daniel. Elliot had not heard from him in more than a decade, and yet, here he was calling, as though it were just another casual check-in. The casual tone in Daniel's voice was infuriating. How could he be so nonchalant after everything that had happened? Daniel claimed it was time for them to catch up, as if the years of silence could be erased with a few simple words. Elliot, unable to contain his anger, hung up without a word. Yet, things took another turn for the worse when one cold evening, Elliot came home to find his mother sitting on the steps outside his apartment. He didn't recognize her at first. She looked older, wearier, and there was an air of sadness about her. Her once vibrant hair was streaked with gray, and her face bore the lines of someone who had lived through hardship. At first, Elliot wasn't sure how to react. His heart pounded with a mix of disbelief, anger, and confusion. This wasn't how he had imagined any potential reunion would happen. "Hi, honey," Linda said softly, standing up as though nothing had changed. Her tone was too casual for someone who had abandoned their child for so long. The memories of the years without her flooded back, and Elliot froze, his mind racing with thoughts of everything he had been through in her absence. His voice came out sharper than he intended as he demanded, "What are you doing here?" He was struggling to understand why she had shown up now, after all these years of ignoring him, of pretending he didn't exist. Linda's face softened, and she stepped forward, nervously wringing her hands. "I just want to talk." "Talk about what?" Elliot asked, his anger growing with every word. "The 12 years you spent pretending I didn't exist? Or the sudden interest now that I have money?" His voice was filled with bitterness, and Linda's face crumpled in response. For a brief moment, Elliot felt a flicker of guilt, but the overwhelming flood of anger drowned it out. He had lived through holidays alone, birthdays without a card, and countless nights where he had longed for his parents' presence. They had left him when he needed them most, and now they wanted to come back. It didn't make sense. Linda stammered, trying to explain herself. "It's not like that," she said, her voice trembling. "Your father and we made mistakes. We want to make things right." But her words only sounded empty to Elliot, who had long since learned to distrust the promises of those who had walked away from him. Just as the confrontation between mother and son reached its boiling point, a car door slammed behind them. Elliot turned to see Daniel, his father, stepping out of a beat-up sedan with a grin on his face. It was the same casual grin that had always irritated Elliot, as though everything was fine, as though they could simply pick up where they had left off. "Hey, kiddo," Daniel said, offering an awkward wave. His tone was light, as if they were meeting after a short time apart rather than years of abandonment. The sight of his father only fueled Elliot's rage. He turned away, heading toward his apartment. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, feeling the anger rise in his chest. But Daniel wasn't ready to let it go. He stepped in front of Elliot, blocking his way. "Wait," he said, his voice pleading. "Please, just hear us out. We know we messed up, but we want to explain." Elliot stopped, his body tense with frustration. "Fine," he said, his voice cold and measured. 5 minutes. Start talking." Elliot had always imagined that, if his parents ever returned, it would be under very different circumstances. He had envisioned heartfelt apologies, long overdue explanations, and perhaps even an apology that might help him heal. But standing before them, with so much anger and hurt built up over the years, he wasn't sure that would ever happen. Still, he gave them those 5 minutes, although deep down, he wasn't sure it would be enough to fix the years of damage they had caused. Linda and Daniel sat awkwardly on his couch, the air thick with tension. Elliot stood across from them, his arms crossed in defiance. He was still processing everything, the years of pain, the silence, and the emotional toll that their abandonment had taken on him. As Daniel began to speak, explaining their actions, Elliot's frustration mounted. "We thought we were doing what was best for you at the time," Daniel said, his voice pleading. He claimed they had been struggling and had thought Elliot would be better off with his grandfather. "Best for me?" Elliot interrupted, his voice sharp. "You dumped me on Grandpa and disappeared. No calls, no visits. Nothing. How exactly was that best for me?" Linda, her voice trembling, tried to explain, saying that they had been struggling financially and emotionally, and they had thought Walter could give Elliot a better life than they could. But to Elliot, it felt like a thin excuse for abandoning him when he needed them the most. "Better life," he scoffed bitterly. "We barely scraped by. Grandpa did his best, but he was old and tired, and you two just moved on with your lives like I never existed." Linda, looking torn, tried again to explain their actions. "We were ashamed," she said. "By the time we realized how badly we had messed up, too much time had passed, and we didn't know how to come back." Elliot shook his head in disbelief. "So what's changed?" "Why now? Let me guess. It's got nothing to do with the $500,000 Grandpa left me, right?" Daniel flushed with embarrassment, and Linda looked as though she might cry. But she quickly denied any connection between their return and the inheritance. She claimed that they had been unaware of the money until recently and that their desire to reconnect was not driven by financial gain. Still, Elliot's mistrust remained. For Elliot, the appearance of his parents after so many years of silence was a cruel reminder that family could be a double-edged sword. His emotions were tangled: anger, confusion, sadness, and a small flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this time, they were being sincere. But with the threat of Daniel contesting the inheritance hanging over him, Elliot wasn't sure if he could ever believe that anything his parents said was genuine. Legal battle and closure. As Elliot grappled with the emotional weight of reconnecting with his estranged parents, life seemed to throw yet another curveball his way. A call from his lawyer, Rebecca Porter, delivered more shocking news. Daniel had filed a claim to contest the inheritance. This sudden legal challenge from his father was a painful reminder that even when things seemed to be improving, the past could rear its ugly head. The inheritance, which had offered Elliot a fresh start, had now become the center of a bitter dispute. Rebecca explained that Daniel was arguing the trust was invalid, claiming that it had been created under undue influence from Elliot's late grandfather, Walter. His father's accusations struck Elliot like a punch to the gut. For years, he had worked tirelessly to survive, doing everything in his power to honor the memory of the man who had taken him in and given him a chance when no one else would. And now, his father was trying to take what little his grandfather had left him. The audacity of Daniel's claim was beyond belief. Determined not to let his father succeed, Elliot prepared himself for a legal battle. The courtroom became the stage for the final confrontation between father and son, a place where Elliot's long-simmering resentment would be tested. The day of the hearing dawned cold and gray, matching the storm of emotions swirling within Elliot. As he entered the courthouse, his lawyer, Rebecca, reminded him to stay calm and focused. "Stick to the facts," she urged, as they made their way inside. In the courtroom, Daniel and his lawyer presented their case with an air of confidence, painting a picture of a father wronged by his son's manipulation. They claimed that Elliot had unfairly influenced Walter during his final years, accusing him of taking advantage of an elderly man's confusion. The sight of his father, sitting at the table with a smug expression, filled Elliot with a mix of anger and disbelief. His father's greed had never been more apparent. But Rebecca, with her sharp legal mind and unwavering confidence, methodically dismantled their arguments. She presented medical records that proved Walter was of sound mind when the trust was created. She even played a recording of a meeting between Walter and his attorney, in which Elliot's grandfather clearly stated his reasons for leaving the inheritance to Elliot. "This money is for Elliot," Walter's voice echoed through the courtroom, a statement that left no room for doubt. Rebecca then turned her attention to Daniel's financial history, revealing his gambling debts and financial irresponsibility. She highlighted the fact that Daniel had previously contested his own mother's will years earlier, further painting him as someone driven by greed rather than family. "This is not a case of undue influence," Rebecca declared. "This is a case of a man desperate for money, willing to exploit his son and his late father's legacy for his own gain." When the judge ruled in Elliot's favor, dismissing Daniel's claim as baseless, a wave of relief washed over him. The victory, however, was bittersweet. While Elliot had won the legal battle, the emotional toll had been immense. The victory did little to mend the rift between him and his father. In fact, it had only widened the chasm between them. Outside the courthouse, Daniel approached Elliot, his voice filled with resentment. "You didn't have to do this," Daniel said, his tone accusatory. Elliot stared at his father, incredulous. "I didn't have to defend myself," he replied, his voice filled with disdain. "You tried to take everything Grandpa left me. What did you expect?" His father's response, "I just wanted what was fair," only fueled Elliot's anger. "You wanted what wasn't yours," Elliot shot back. "There's nothing fair about that." Without another word, Daniel turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Linda, who had stayed behind, looked at Elliot with a mixture of sadness and guilt. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know he was going to do this." Elliot, His emotions running high, met her gaze. "Didn't you?" he asked sharply. "You knew what he was like. You knew he was going to try something like this." Linda shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "I swear, Elliot, I came back because I wanted to make things right. I didn't want him to hurt you any more than he already has." For the first time, Elliot looked at his mother with a sense of clarity. Her words seemed genuine, but the damage had already been done. He needed time to process everything. "I need time," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Take all the time you need," Linda replied, her voice breaking. Over the following weeks, Elliot focused on rebuilding his life. He found solace in the small victories, paying off the remaining debts, starting a new chapter, and slowly learning how to heal from the wounds of his past. It was during this time that he found a letter from his grandfather, a note that Walter had written just months before his passing. The letter, which Walter had left for Elliot, provided the closure he had longed for. Walter had written that he believed in Elliot, that he had always seen his strength, and that the inheritance wasn't just about money, it was a chance for Elliot to build the life he deserved. The letter brought tears to Elliot's eyes as he read the heartfelt words. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. He understood now why Walter had left him everything. It wasn't about the money, it was about giving Elliot the opportunity to move forward and build a life free from the burden of the past. 2 months later, Elliot met Linda at a quiet coffee shop. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. Linda, her face etched with regret, admitted that she had been weak. She and Daniel had thought they were doing the right thing, but they were wrong. "I've regretted it every day since," she said softly. "Now, I want to fix this." Over time, Linda proved that her remorse was genuine. She visited Walter's grave with Elliot, where she broke down in tears, apologizing for everything. Slowly, their relationship began to heal, but it was clear that there would always be scars. As for Daniel, Elliot never heard from him again. Some bridges, he realized, were better left burned. In the end, Elliot found peace, not in the inheritance, but in finally taking control of his own life. He no longer needed his parents to validate his worth. For the first time, he felt free to build a future unburdened by the mistakes of the past. And with that, Elliot Harris began the journey of rebuilding his life, not with the help of his parents, but on his own terms.